June 12, 2024, the day America's longest advantage collapsed in Venezuela. Let me tell you something that almost no one in Washington wants to. What happened in Venezuela last week wasn't just another diplomatic setback. It was the unraveling of a geopolitical edge the United States has held for more than a century, one so fundamental to American power that its loss will reverberate through the 21st century. And yet, if you read the headlines or listened to the Sunday talk shows, you'd think this was just another routine election in a troubled Latin American country. That's by design. I've spent the last 3 decades studying the intersection of energy, great power competition, and the slow-motion decline of American hegemony. I've advised policymakers, written classified briefs, and watched as the same patterns repeat themselves, first in the Middle East, then in Eastern Europe, and now, catastrophically, in our own hemisphere. What unfolded in Venezuela last week wasn't an accident. It was the culmination of a decade of strategic blunders, ideological overreach, and a refusal to accept that the world has changed. And if we don't understand what just happened, we won't see the next crisis coming until it's too late. Here's what they want you to. On June 12, Venezuela held a presidential election that was, according to the U.S. State Department, neither free nor fair. Nicolas Maduro, the incumbent strongman, claimed victory amid widespread allegations of fraud, voter intimidation, and electoral irregularities. The White House, in a carefully worded statement, condemned the results, reaffirmed its support for opposition leader Edmundo Gonzalez, and announced new sanctions targeting Venezuela's oil sector. The New York Times ran a front-page story with the headline "Venezuela's sham election deepens crisis," while CNN featured a tale of experts discussing whether Maduro's grip on power was finally weakening. The narrative was democracy had been thwarted, the people had spoken, and the United States, as the leader of the free world, had a moral obligation to stand with the Venezuelan opposition. But there's a problem with this narrative. A big problem. The data doesn't support it. The history doesn't support it. And most damning of all, the geopolitical reality certainly doesn't support it. Let's start with the facts they're not telling you. First, the election itself. Yes, there were irregularities, there always are in Venezuela. But here's what the media glossed: the opposition participated. That's right. After years of boycotting elections under the argument that the system was irredeemably rigged, the opposition, led by Maria Corina Machado and her proxy Gonzalez, decided to compete. They did so because, for the first time in years, they had a real shot. Polls showed Gonzalez leading by double digits. The economy was in shambles. Maduro's approval rating was in the low 20s. The opposition had momentum, international backing, and, crucially, the support of the United States. So what happened? The most plausible explanation isn't fraud on the scale the U.S. claims. It's that Maduro, facing the very real prospect of losing, allowed the opposition to participate just enough to lend the election a veneer of legitimacy, then pulled the rug out from under them at the last moment. He didn't need to steal the election outright. He just needed to steal enough to tip the balance. And that's exactly what he did. But here's where it gets interesting. The U.S. response wasn't about democracy. It was about oil. Venezuela sits on the largest proven oil reserves in the world, bigger than Saudi Arabia's. For decades, that oil was effectively controlled by American commies, even after Hugo Chavez nationalized the industry in the 2000s. The U.S. maintained leverage through sanctions, through the dollar's dominance in global energy markets, and through the simple fact that no one else could buy Venezuelan oil without risking Washington's wrath. That was America's longest: the ability to dictate who could and couldn't access the world's most critical resource. That advantage is now gone. Let me explain why. In 2019, the Trump administration imposed crippling sanctions on Venezuela's oil sector, cutting off its primary source of revenue. The goal was to strangle Maduro's regime and force him out. It didn't work. Instead, Maduro turned to Russia and China. Moscow sent in Rosneft to keep the oil flowing. Beijing extended billions in loans, secured by future oil shipments. And when the U.S. tried to enforce secondary sanctions, threatening to punish any country that bought Venezuelan oil, both Russia and China called Washington's bluff. They started buying Venezuelan crude at a discount, refining it in their own facilities, and selling it on the global market. The U.S. could sanction individual tankers, but it couldn't stop the flow. The genie was out of the bottle. Then came the real game: the war in Ukraine. When the West imposed sanctions on Russian oil, global energy markets went into chaos. Prices spiked. Europe scrambled for alternatives. And suddenly, Venezuela, with its vast, untapped reserves, became too valuable to ignore. The Biden administration, desperate to lower gas prices ahead of the 2024 election, did something: it eased sanctions on Venezuela. In October 2023, the U.S. granted Chevron a license to resume limited operations in the country. The message was: we need your oil. Maduro, ever the opportunist, played along. He released political prisoners. He promised free elections. He even allowed the opposition to campaign. But he never intended to lose. And when the election results came in showing Gonzales with a narrow lead, Maduro did what autocrats: he declared victory, arrested opposition figures, and dared the U.S. to do something about it. Here's the U.S. can't do much about it. Not anymore. That's the real story of June 12. It wasn't just an election. It was the moment the United States lost its ability to control Venezuela's oil. And in doing so, it lost a pillar of its global energy dominance. For the first time in a century, American power is no longer the decisive factor in who gets access to the world's most important commodity. Russia and China have broken the monopoly. And they're not giving it back. Now, let's out. Because this isn't just about Venezuela. It's about the end of an era. For the past 30 years, the United States has operated under a simple that it could shape the world and its image through a combination of military power, economic coercion, and ideological appeal. This was the era of liberal hegemony, the belief that democracy, free markets, and American leadership were the natural endpoint of human history. The collapse of the Soviet Union seemed to prove it. So did the action of NATO, the integration of China into the global economy, and the spread of American cultural influence. But that era is over. What we're witnessing now is the return of great power competition, not as a temporary aberration, but as the defining feature of the 21st century. And Venezuela is just one front in this larger struggle. Let's talk about the players. On one side, you have the United States, still the world's most powerful country, but one that is increasingly stretched thin. Its military is overcommit. Its alliances are fraying. Its domestic politics are polarized to the point of dysfunction. And its economic model, built on the dollar's dominance and the assumption of endless growth, is showing cracks. On the other side, you have the revisionist Russia, China, and to a lesser extent, Iran. They don't want to destroy the U.S. They want to replace it as the dominant force in their respective regions. And they're playing a different game. While the U.S. is still trying to export democracy and free markets, these countries are focused on one: sovereignty. They want to control their own resources, set their own rules, and push back against American interference. And they're willing to make deals with anyone, democracies, autocracies, it doesn't matter, to achieve that goal. Venezuela is a perfect example. For Russia, it's a foothold in America's backyard, a way to distract Washington from Ukraine and force it to divide its attention. For China, it's a source of cheap oil and a testing ground for its no-strings-attached development model. For Iran, it's a partner in evading U.S. sanctions and projecting influence in the Western Hemisphere. And for all three, it's a chance to prove that the U.S. isn't as powerful as it thinks. Now, let's talk about the military dimension. Because this is where things get dangerous. The U.S. has a long history of intervening in Latin America, sometimes for good reasons, sometimes for terrible ones. But the world has changed. In the 1980s, the U.S. could invade Grenada or AMA with minimal consequences. In the 2000s, it could overthrow Saddam Hussein and occupy Iraq for a decade. Today? The idea of a U.S. military intervention in Venezuela is a non-starter. Why? 3 reasons. First, the U.S. military is exhausted. After 20 years of war in the Middle East, it's struggling to recruit, modernize, and maintain readiness. The Navy is stretched thin in the Pacific. The Air Force is short on pilots. The Army is still recovering from Afghanistan. The last thing the Pentagon wants is another open-ended commitment in a country where the enemy isn't a clear-cut terrorist group, but a well-armed, Russian-backed regime with deep popular support in some quarters. Second, the geopolitical risks are too high. Venezuela isn't Iraq. It's not a failed state with no allies. It's a country with deep ties to Russia, China, and Iran. An invasion would risk direct confrontation with nuclear-armed powers. Imagine U.S. troops seizing Venezuelan oil fields, only to find Russian mercenaries from the Wagner Group dug in and ready to fight. Imagine Chinese warships showing up in the Caribbean to protect their interests. Imagine Iran retaliating by attacking U.S. forces in Syria or Iraq. This isn't a Tom Clancy novel. It's a very real possibility. Third, and most importantly, the American public has no appetite for another war. After Iraq and Afghanistan, the idea of sending troops into Venezuela where the mission would be unclear, the exit strategy non-existent, and the body bags real is political suicide. Even the most hawkish members of Congress know this. That's why the U.S. response to Venezuela has been limited to sanctions, rhetoric, and half-hearted support for the opposition. It's not because Washington doesn't care. It's because it can't do more. But here's the thing about they only work if you have leverage. And in Venezuela, the U.S. has none left. Let me tell you a story. In 2019, when the Trump administration imposed its maximum pressure campaign on Venezuela, the idea was cut off Maduro's oil revenue, and his regime would collapse. It didn't work. Instead, Maduro adapted. He sold oil to China and India at a discount. He used cryptocurrency to evade sanctions. He allowed Russian and Iranian tankers to transport Venezuelan crude under false flags. And when the U.S. tried to enforce secondary sanctions, threatening to punish any commis that did business with Venezuela, China and Russia simply ignored them. The result? Venezuela's oil production, which had collapsed to under 700,000 barrels per day in 2020, is now back up to over 1 million barrels per day. And while that's still far below its peak of 3.5 million barrels in the 1990s, it's enough to keep Maduro in power. More importantly, it's enough to keep Russia and China interested. Because for them, Venezuela isn't just about oil. It's about proving that the U.S. can't dictate the rules of the global economy anymore. This is the new reality. The U.S. can sanction Venezuela all it wants. It can declare Maduro a dictator. It can recognize Gonzales as the legitimate president. But none of that changes the fact that Venezuela's oil is flowing to China, Russia, and even India, countries that don't care about American democracy promotion. And every barrel that goes to them is a barrel that doesn't go to the U.S. or its allies. Now, let's talk about the domestic political dimension. Because this isn't just about geopolitics. It's about elections, swing states, and the short-term thinking that dominates American foreign policy. Here's how hard the Biden administration's Venezuela policy isn't driven by grand strategy. It's driven by Florida. Florida is the ultimate swing state. It's home to a large Venezuelan exile community, many of whom fled Maduro's regime and are deeply invested in seeing him fall. These voters are a key part of the Republican base, but they're also a potential swing bloc in a tight election. And in 2024, with the race between Biden and Trump expected to be razor close, neither party can afford to ignore them. That's why, in the lead up to the election, the Biden administration walked a tightrope. It eased sanctions to lower gas prices, but it also kept up the pressure on Maduro to hold a free and fair election. When Maduro rigged the vote, the administration had no choice but to condemn it. But it also knew that a full-throated push for regime change would be politically risky. After all, if the U.S. really wanted to remove Maduro, it would have to do more than just talk. And that's something no one in Washington wants to contemplate. This is the problem with American foreign policy today. It's not driven by a coherent strategy. It's driven by domestic politics, short-term thinking, and the need to please key voting blocs. And in the case of Venezuela, that's led to a policy that is neither tough enough to force Maduro out nor flexible enough to adapt to the new reality. So where does this leave us? Let's run through the scenarios. Scenario: the best case. In this scenario, the U.S. and its allies manage to pressure Maduro into a power-sharing agreement.
The opposition gets a role in government. Sanctions are eased. Oil production increases.
Venezuela slowly stabilizes. It's not a perfect outcome, but it's the least bad option.
The problem? Maduro has no incentive to agree to this.
He survived sanctions, coups, and mass protests.
Why would he give up power now? Scenario: the most likely outcome.
Maduro stays in power. The US imposes more sanctions, but they have little effect.
Venezuela's oil continues to flow to China and Russia.
The opposition is crushed. The country remains a failed state, but one that is now firmly in the orbit of America's adversaries.
This is the scenario we're heading toward.
It's not a victory for anyone, but it's the path of least resistance. Scenario: the worst case.
This is where things get ugly. Maduro, feeling cornered, lashes out. He cuts off oil exports to the US entirely. He allows Russian and Iranian military assets into Venezuela. He starts supporting anti-American groups in the region.
The US responds with a naval blockade.
Russia sends warships to break it. China threatens economic retaliation.
Before you know it, we're in a new Cold War, one that could turn hot very quickly.
None of these scenarios are good.
But the most likely one, the one where Maduro stays in power and Venezuela becomes a permanent thorn in America's side, is the one we're sleepwalking into.
Now, let's step back even further. Because what's happening in Venezuela isn't just about Venezuela. It's about the broader collapse of American hegemony.
For decades, the US has operated under the assumption that it could shape the world in its image. It could invade countries to spread democracy.
It could impose sanctions to force compliance. It could use the dollar's dominance to punish its enemies.
And for a while, it worked. But the world has changed. The rise of China, the resurgence of Russia, and the fragmentation of the global economy have made it harder and harder for the US to get its way.
This is what the realists have been warning about for years. The era of American unipolarity is over.
The question now is whether the US can adapt to a multipolar world or whether it will keep trying to impose its will, even as its power wanes.
Venezuela is a case study in this dynamic. The US tried to force Maduro out. It failed.
Now, it's left with it: accept reality and deal with Maduro as he is, or double down on a failed strategy and risk a wider conflict.
The smart move would be to recognize that the old playbook doesn't work anymore.
The US needs a new approach, one that accepts the limits of its power and focuses on managing great power competition rather than trying to dominate it.
Here's what that would look. First, the US should stop pretending that sanctions alone can change regimes. They don't. They never have.
All they do is push countries into the arms of America's adversaries. Instead of trying to strangle Venezuela's economy, the US should offer a path to sanctions relief in exchange for real concessions like free and fair elections, the release of political prisoners, and a commitment to economic reform.
Second, the US should recognize that it can't control global energy markets anymore. The era of American energy dominance is over.
The future belongs to countries that can adapt to a multipolar world, one where oil is traded in multiple currencies, where pipelines cross borders without US approval, and where the dollar isn't the only game in town. The US needs to invest in energy independence, not just for itself, but for its allies. That means more nuclear, more renewables, and a realistic approach to fossil fuels.
Third, the US should stop trying to export democracy at the point of a gun. The world doesn't work that way.
Countries like Venezuela, Cuba, and Nicaragua aren't going to become liberal democracies just because the US wants them to. The best the US can do is contain their influence, support civil society, and wait for the inevitable backlash against authoritarianism to play out.
Finally, the US needs to accept that it can't be the world's policeman anymore. It can't intervene everywhere. It can't sanction everyone. It can't force the world to bend to its will.
The sooner Washington internalizes this, the better. But that's easier said than done, because the foreign policy establishment is still clinging to the idea that America's decline is a choice, not a reality.
They point to the US military budget, still larger than the next 10 countries combined, and say, see? We're still on top. But raw spending doesn't tell the whole story. What matters is how that power is projected, and more importantly, whether it can achieve the outcomes Washington wants. In Venezuela, it couldn't. And that failure isn't an anomaly, it's a sign of things to come. Now, what most people don't realize is that this isn't just about Venezuela. It's about the entire architecture of U.S. power in Latin America, and by extension, the world. For decades, the U.S. has relied on a few key pillars to maintain its dominance in its own economic coercion through sanctions, military intimidation via bases and training programs, and the soft power of cultural and ideological influence. But all three are eroding, and Venezuela is where the cracks are most visible. Take the military dimension. The U.S. has spent the last century treating Latin America as its exclusive sphere of influence, intervening at will Guatemala in 1954, Chile in 1973, Grenada in 1983, AMA in 1989, Haiti in 1994, and countless covert operations in between. The message was cross Washington, and you'll pay. But that playbook only works if the target believes the U.S. is both willing and able to follow through. In Venezuela, the U.S. tried to signal resolve with sanctions, threats, and even a botched coup attempt in 2019. But Maduro didn't blink. Why? Because he knew something the U.S. foreign policy blob refuses to. America's military options are far more limited than they used to be. Let me explain why this matters. The U.S. still has an overwhelming conventional military advantage, but that advantage is useless in a place like Venezuela. You can't invade a country of 28 million people with a standing army of 120,000 and expect to hold it. The U.S. learned that lesson in Iraq and Afghanistan, but apparently, the Pentagon's institutional memory only lasts until the next budget cycle. Even if the U.S. wanted to launch a limited strike, say, against Venezuela's oil infrastructure, it would risk escalation with Russia and Iran, both of which have military advisors and equipment in the country. Moscow has already warned that any attack on Venezuela would be considered an attack on Russia. That's not an idle threat. In 2019, 2 Russian nuclear-capable bombers landed in Caracas as a show of force. The message was Venezuela is now part of a broader anti-American axis, and the U.S. can't touch it without risking a wider conflict. Here's the uncomfortable: the U.S. is no longer the only military power with a global reach. Russia and China have both extended their presence in Latin America, not just in Venezuela but in Cuba, Nicaragua, and even Argentina, where China is building a space tracking station that could have dual-use military applications. The U.S. can still project power, but it can't do so without consequences. Every time Washington tries to flex its muscles, it risks pushing more countries into the arms of its rivals. That's exactly what happened in Venezuela. The more the U.S. squeezed Maduro, the closer he got to Moscow and Beijing. Today, Venezuela is effectively a client state of Russia and China, hosting Russian troops, buying Chinese weapons, and selling oil in yuan. That's not just a diplomatic setback, it's a strategic defeat. But the military implications go deeper. The U.S. has long relied on Latin America as a secure rear base for its global operations. The AMA Canal, the Guantanamo Bay Naval Base, the drug interdiction missions in Colombia and Central America, all of these depend on the region being stable and aligned with Washington. But if Venezuela can defy the U.S. and get away with it, why can't others? Already, we're seeing signs of that. Nicaragua has deepened its ties with Russia, allowing Russian troops to train on its soil. Bolivia has expelled U.S. DEA agents and pivoted toward China. Even Mexico, a U.S. neighbor and major trading partner, has refused to condemn Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The Monroe Doctrine is dead, and the U.S. is struggling to come to terms with it. So what does this mean for U.S. military strategy? First, it means the Pentagon needs to stop planning for wars it can't win. The U.S. can't invade Venezuela, and it can't force regime change through sanctions or covert ops. What it can do is contain the spillover effects, preventing Venezuela from becoming a launchpad for Russian or Chinese military operations in the hemisphere. That means working with allies like Colombia and Brazil to monitor Venezuelan military movements, interdict arms shipments, and counter disinformation. It also means accepting that some countries will fall into the orbit of America's rivals, and focusing on denying them strategic depth. Second, the US needs to rethink its basing strategy. For decades, the US has relied on a network of bases in Latin America to project power into the Atlantic and the Caribbean.
But if those bases become targets either through direct attack or political pressure, then the entire architecture of US power projection is at risk. The US should be diversifying its basing options, not just in Latin America but globally. That means strengthening ties with countries like Guyana, which is rapidly becoming a key player in the region's energy sector, and investing in mobile, distributed forces that can operate without fixed bases. Finally, the US needs to recognize that military power alone can't solve its problems. The era of gunboat diplomacy is over. Today, the real battles are fought in the economic and informational domains. The US still has an edge in both, but it's squandering it by relying on blunt instruments like sanctions and military threats. Instead, it should be using its economic leverage to build coalitions, not punishments. That means offering carrots as well as sticks, trade deals, investment, and technology transfers in exchange for alignment on key issues. It also means countering Russian and Chinese influence not with military posturing, but with a better alternative. Right now, the US isn't offering one. The collapse of America's longest advantage in Venezuela isn't just a foreign policy failure. It's a wake-up call. The US is still the world's most powerful country, but its ability to shape the world and its image is fading. The question now is whether Washington can adapt, or whether it will keep doubling down on strategies that no longer work. The smart money is on the latter. The foreign policy establishment is too invested in the old way of doing things to change course. But if the US keeps pretending it can still call the shots in Latin America, it's going to find itself increasingly isolated and increasingly irrelevant. Now, what most people don't realize is that this isn't just a story about Venezuela, it's a story about America's own political dysfunction. The collapse of US influence in Caracas isn't happening in a vacuum. It's the direct result of decades of ideological rigidity in Washington, where foreign policy has become less about strategy and more about performative outrage. And the domestic political dimensions of this failure are just as damning as the geopolitical ones. Let me explain why this matters. For the past 20 years, US policy toward Venezuela has been a bipartisan disaster, but not in the way most people think. It's not that Democrats and Republicans disagree on the fundamentals, they don't. Both parties have treated Venezuela as a moral crusade rather than a geopolitical problem. The difference is in the packaging. Republicans frame it as a battle against socialism, while Democrats frame it as a defense of democracy. But the underlying assumption that the US can and should dictate Venezuela's political future has remained constant. And that assumption is what's killing us now. Take the 2019 recognition of Juan Guaidó as Venezuela's interim president. On paper, it was a bold move. The US and 50-plus allies declared Nicolas Maduro illegitimate and threw their weight behind an opposition figure who, at the time, had the support of a significant portion of Venezuela's population. But here's the uncomfortable: it was a gamble built on sand. The Trump administration assumed that if they declared Guaidó president, the Venezuelan military would abandon Maduro, the regime would collapse, and the US would be hailed as the liberator of a nation. None of that happened. The military stayed loyal. Maduro dug in. And Guaidó, who once drew crowds of tens of thousands, is now a political afterthought, his legitimacy eroded by time, infighting, and the simple fact that he never actually governed anything. The Biden administration inherited this mess and, rather than rethinking the approach, doubled down. They kept Guaidó on life support, maintained the sanctions, and even flirted with the idea of military intervention. Remember those vague threats about all options being on the table in 2021? But by then, the moment had passed. The Venezuelan opposition had fractured. The economy, already in freefall, had adapted to sanctions through black markets and Chinese and Russian lifelines. And most critically, the US had lost the moral high ground. When Maduro's regime arrested opposition figures or rigged elections, the world shrugged. Why? Because after years of US sanctions that crippled Venezuela's economy and killed thousands through preventable shortages, Washington no longer had the credibility to play the democracy card. This is where domestic politics comes in. The US foreign policy establishment has become so polarized that even when it's clear a strategy isn't working, no one in Washington has the political capital or the intellectual honesty to admit it. For Republicans, Venezuela is a culture war issue. They need Maduro to be a villain because it fits their narrative about socialism and the dangers of left-wing governance. For Democrats, it's about human rights and democracy, but they can't afford to look soft on a regime that's become a symbol of anti-Americanism. So both sides keep pushing the same failed policies, hoping that this time, somehow, they'll work. The result is a feedback loop of failure. Sanctions don't topple Maduro, so the US imposes more sanctions. The opposition can't win elections, so the US declares the elections illegitimate. The regime cracks down on dissent, so the US imposes more sanctions. And all the while, China and Russia are quietly filling the void, offering Venezuela loans, oil deals, and military cooperation without the moralizing lectures. It's a textbook case of how ideological rigidity in foreign policy leads to strategic incompetence. Now, let's talk about the 2024 election, because that's where this story gets even uglier. Venezuela has already become a political football in the US presidential race, and the way it's being used should terrify anyone who cares about coherent foreign policy. For the Trump campaign, Venezuela is a cautionary tale about what happens when America lets socialism take over. They're not interested in solving the crisis, they're interested in using it to scare voters. And if Trump wins, we can expect more of the more sanctions, more bluster, and more performative toughness that does nothing to actually change the situation on the ground. For Biden, the calculus is more complicated. He's caught between a rock and a hard place. On one hand, he can't afford to look weak on Venezuela, especially with Trump accusing him of being soft on socialism. On the other hand, he knows that the current approach isn't working. So what does he do? He tries to thread the needle. He keeps the sanctions in place but offers temporary relief, like the 2023 deal that allowed Chevron to resume limited oil operations in Venezuela in exchange for Maduro's promise to hold free elections. It's a classic Washington half measure that satisfies no one. The left wing of his party calls it a betrayal of democratic values. The right calls it appeasement. And Maduro? He pockets the concessions and does whatever he wants anyway. Here's the thing about half they're worse than no measures at all. Because they signal weakness without delivering results. The Biden administration's approach to Venezuela is a perfect example. By offering sanctions relief without demanding real concessions, they've given Maduro a lifeline without getting anything meaningful in return. And by keeping the door open to future sanctions, they've ensured that Venezuela's economy remains in a state of perpetual instability. It's the worst of both worlds. So what happens next? Let's game out the scenarios. First, there's the status quo. Maduro stays in power, the US keeps up its sanctions regime, and Venezuela remains a failed state with a government that's increasingly dependent on China and Russia. This is the most likely outcome, and it's the one that should worry us the most. Because in this scenario, the US isn't just losing influence in Venezuela, it's losing influence in the entire region. Other Latin American countries are watching, and they're drawing conclusions. If the US can't even shape outcomes in a country where it has overwhelming economic leverage, what does that say about its ability to lead in the hemisphere? The answer is it says America's power is fading. Second, there's the collapse scenario. Maduro's regime implodes, either through a military coup, a popular uprising, or an economic meltdown. This is what the US has been hoping for since 2019, but it's not the slam dunk Washington thinks it is. Because if Maduro falls, there's no guarantee that what comes next will be better. Venezuela's opposition is divided, its institutions are hollowed out, and its military is corrupt. The most likely outcome of a sudden collapse would be chaos, a power vacuum that could be filled by criminal gangs, rogue military factions, or even foreign mercenaries. And in that chaos, the US would be expected to step in, either with aid or with troops. But after 2 decades of failed interventions in the Middle East, does anyone seriously believe the American public would support another one in Latin America? Third, there's the negotiated transition. This is the least likely scenario, but it's the only one that offers a real path forward. It would require the US to do something it hasn't done and engage in real diplomacy. That means sitting down with Maduro not to demand his surrender, but to negotiate a phased transition of power. It means offering sanctions relief in exchange for free and fair elections, with international observers and guarantees for opposition participation.
It means working with regional partners like Brazil, Mexico, and Colombia to create a framework for stability. And most importantly, it means accepting that the US can't dictate the outcome.
Venezuela's future has to be decided by Venezuelans, not by Washington. The problem with this scenario is that it requires political courage, and right now, there's none of that in Washington. The foreign policy establishment would scream betrayal.
The media would frame it as appeasement.
And the American public, which has been fed a steady diet of Venezuela as boogeyman for years, would be deeply skeptical.
But it's the only scenario that doesn't end in disaster.
Because the alternative, more of the same, is a recipe for perpetual crisis.
I'm not saying the US should abandon its principles.
I'm saying it should abandon its illusions. The idea that America can still call the shots in Latin America is a relic of the 20th century.
The region has changed. Its governments are more assertive. Its economies are more integrated with China. And its people are more skeptical of US interference.
The US can either adapt to this reality or keep pretending it's 1954, when the CIA could overthrow a government in Guatemala and no one batted an eye. The collapse of America's longest advantage in Venezuela isn't just a foreign policy failure. It's a symptom of a deeper political system that's incapable of learning from its mistakes. And until that changes, we're going to keep seeing the same patterns play out again and again. The US will overestimate its power.
It will underestimate its adversaries. It will double down on failed strategies.
And in the end, it will find itself on the wrong side of history.
The question now is whether anyone in Washington is paying attention. My guess? They're not.
Because in this town, admitting failure is the one thing that's harder than actually fixing the problem.